Alright, I want to give my bit on Apple versus Adobe. And man, this is a heated topic. I'm passionate about it. I know been debates on Twitter with myself and other YouTubers out there. Lots of bloggers, lots of articles, lots of opinions out there. First, I want to start out the gate that this is not a debate meant to be anti-Apple or anti-Adobe. 2. Flash is this lightning rod within the debate, in that because Flash has never been allowed on any of the iPhone OS's platforms. Out of the gate, I support Apple and their decision for that. Flash is not going to run on the iPhone OS, at least for now. Maybe Adobe makes some future Flash version, who knows, or maybe not, that Apple will accept. But for now, it's not going to be on any of the iPhone OS or iPad OS platform. Not allowed. So, what is the issue then? Why is there still a debate between what Adobe wants to do with the iPhone and what Apple is prohibiting? Basically, it's Apple dictating what it's going to allow in terms of origin languages and documentation to the API, or links to the API. And they're going to have complete control over that, and that's stipulated within this section. So what does that do? First and foremost, this is not something that Apple is doing alone. It's Microsoft and other companies that have also done similar things. So it's not just, let's just blame Apple, because I know Apple itself is a lightning rod for a lot of debate. And so I agree with a lot of Apple fans in saying, well, when Apple does this, it's all of a sudden a big hoopla versus someone else. In my book, everyone gets equally blamed. So, if it's not about Flash running on the iPhone, how and what is Adobe doing in argument with Apple to be able to participate on the iPhone OS and iPad OS alike? They want to be able to let developers that are used to using Adobe's tools, specifically that are toolkits that Adobe has for developers to build Flash applications. And they create a converter, just to simplify in terms, and the converter takes this Flash code stuff, converts it into an iPhone application, native. No Flash whatsoever. You couldn't even tell the difference if you were to look at it. It's going to look exactly like an iPhone app, because it is an iPhone app. And Adobe's not the only one that does this. There are plenty other third-party companies that do the same things in different ways. Products like Corona, Game Salad, monotouch, and Unity 3D. Within these respective companies, there's a lot of questions saying, well, does this affect them, so on and so forth, because in the text it's clear, well, the originating code needs to be X, Y, and Z. And a lot of these products don't necessarily have their start code in those forms. It could be C#, it could be Lua, it could be any other thing, Python. So take Unity 3D, an example would be Zombieville, USA. Also, as I mentioned earlier, Lua, which is a very powerful scripting language, very popular within games, especially embedded games. An example would be Earthworm Jim. Or even Python-based, where Python has to be taken and then brought into a compiler to C++ and then finally going over to the iPhone. An example would be Elephants. You would actually be surprised at how many applications are in the App Store that don't really originate from Apple's current specifications for OS 4. Whether they're built in Unity or monotouch or being used in Corona or using Lua. So you can see there's a whole lot of developer preference for which languages a developer programmer want to use. But many are still saying it doesn't matter. Adobe is sneaking Flash in, or it's still going to be Flash in some sort of form. Well, if Flash is not allowed on the iPhone, there's no way that a Flash application can even run on an iPhone. There's a bit of surprise. There are already apps on the iPhone and in the App Store using Adobe's toolkit. How can that be? It's not sneaking Flash. Flash can't run. Apps like this: Red Hood, Boost Your Brain, That Roach, or apps like Chroma Circuit or Alchemist. So they're already on the platform. How can this be? If they're really trying to sneak Flash, those apps wouldn't be able to run. And that's the big shocker. These apps are already there. They are native iPhone applications using Adobe's toolkit. So to conclude that point, they are simply not Flash in any aspect. So this causes a conundrum now. Apple's already really approved a lot of these Adobe Toolkit generated iPhone apps, and they've decided to change it for OS 4. The sad thing is that there's a lot of developer buzz, whether they're using many of these toolkits that I've already mentioned, trying to get confirmation from Apple on who's going to get banned and who's not going to get banned. And quite frankly, one of the developers even left a note on one of their applications, Alchemist. And the funny thing is that many have this attitude of, well, if you don't like it, go program for somewhere else. The funny thing is, developers may just do that. An example would be the statement read by the developers of the application Alchemist, stating, Alchemist was built using Adobe Flash CS5. Recently, Apple has decided to block all third-party development tools and applications that were built using those tools. We fear for the worst. We fear that Alchemist will not be here any longer. We have already invested money on Apple's hardware, software, and developer licenses just to be part of the iPhone development platform. We don't regret it. It was fun. But apparently we are not welcome here anymore because of the choice of our development tools. And so are many other developers. Please support us by purchasing Alchemist for the special buy-buy price. We have frozen all current development efforts for the iPhone platform and frozen 3 new game titles until we get official statement from Apple. However, we will continue to develop games and applications for other platforms: Android, Nokia, Samsung, BlackBerry, and the desktop. So please follow us on Twitter for product announcements. You see, developers have preferences. They're human beings. Some may like to program in C#, some may like to program in C++, some may like to program in Python, others in Java, others in Objective-C. And many times they won't have to learn another language, because that, in many cases, means more time, lost money, when they could be using existing toolkits and platforms. Programmers, being human beings, get comfortable in the toolsets and toolkits that they use, and thus they program in it to deploy elsewhere. In many regards, what I do in many cases. An analogy would be like Oracle telling me that if I wanted to program Java, that I could only use NetBeans, their native IDE, versus, say, TextMate or Eclipse, whatever, to program for Java, even though Java is Java. The thing of it is that that section agreement predicates in a hope that developers will drop their toolkits and then go and learn Objective-C. That's a pretty big gamble. And developers are important. I think Microsoft stipulated that heavily. Developers, developers, developers. So really what's going on is that a developer has a tool set. We program in a language of our choice, and usually we have tools that help us take our code and convert it and or port it to our desired platform where we wish it to run, and run in some sort of native form over there, and then maybe over here. So we are starting in one place as I'll put up here on the screen, and using the toolkit, which is our development platform, go through, rewrite, it gets converted to whatever the destination native platform is needed, and job well done. Rapid deployment and a large consumer base that we could sell to. There's the argument of exclusivity. This isn't consoles, and you can't really make an analogy to consoles. Consoles many times have proprietary APIs where their visual source is protected, and therefore giving it out as it doesn't exist as a standard language. But the question is for developers, is exclusivity and the cost of doing so for solely developing for the iPhone worth the cost in the end to themselves, when they have to have the expense of doing it, i.e. just for the iPhone, versus the other platforms that may be open to their toolkit? Another guy out there, John Legg Johansson, had a statement, because basically the Steve Jobs quote, which was in the email where Steve Jobs talks about being there before with intermediate layers between the platform and the developer, and that it makes a subpar application. Well, John Legg Johansson basically states, hey, well, what about iTunes on Windows? So John Legg Johansson is saying, well, since iTunes is not using a native language within Windows, Steve Jobs is essentially stating that Windows for iTunes is also subpar. And by using Steve Jobs' logic, Microsoft should start banning Apple's applications that are not using Microsoft native APIs. Getting back to the layers between the programmer and the platform in regards to Steve Jobs' quote, suggests or implies that quality comes with using native APIs. That is false. Just because one uses, say, Objective-C or Xcode does not guarantee a quality application. There are plenty of applications using Xcode out there that there are bug reports, or maybe it's lagging or too slow. So it is a complete fallacy to say, hey, using Xcode and Objective-C guarantees good code quality. And that needs to be noted. The other thing is there's nothing that even says that using third-party tools produces crappy applications. You already have third-party tools that start in C#, not a native code language for the iPhone. C# is a Microsoft-created language, like Unity 3D or monotouch, that produce great games. Lua is not supported on the iPhone, and that script is very powerful and creates great games. So one can't say just because you use Xcode you're going to produce quality apps, or because you use third-party apps you're going to produce crappy applications. I can see where Apple's going and trying to get more people to use Xcode, in that, yeah, if you do convince more developers to use Xcode, it really brings a lot of developers to the Mac. And the iPhone is their strongest arm right now to try to bring developers to the whole Mac ecosystem. And I figure that since if they are going to use the iPhone and use Xcode for there, why not start programming for OS X in the Mac? Again, that's a gamble, though. There's nothing saying that developers are actually going to do that. And quite frankly, many platforms try to go out of their way to support as many or they try to go out of their way in saying, fine, if you can compile or whatever, and as long as you meet X, Y, and Z standards, we're good with it. So the main reason why there's a whole lot of a buzz, and it's still Apple's prerogative, and it could very well be challenged in the court of law, but the whole conundrum and the heat over it is that it does create double standards. You already really have approved and authorized Adobe Toolkit generated applications in the App Store and on the iPhone. You have other third-party toolkits and applications doing the same thing in their own ways to the iPhone development platform. And these guys want to know. And I don't think saying, hey, if you don't like it, go somewhere else, has a good, really long-term effect. if developers really do go somewhere else, who remains to keep programming for the iPhone platform? I know a lot of the heat from this Adobe debate stems from the whole CS4 not being 64-bit. And I know that there were many statements that, oh, there was 2 years sufficient time, and oh, it was all Adobe's fault and this and that. Well, on August 7, 2006, the WWDC 2006 keynote, Forstall told the crowd that Leopard will have support for 64-bit applications. Quote from Forstall: "We've now got 64-bit Unix. In Leopard, take this a giant leap forward with 64-bit Carbon and Cocoa, all the way to your applications. You can have fully native 64-bit UI Carbon or Cocoa applications." Now, that's WWDC 2006 stating that's what's going to exist in Leopard. CS3 was released March 2007, and CS4 was already planned to use 64-bit Carbon. The other problem that compounded it is that developer seeds through 2007 had Carbon 64-bit libraries. So WWDC 2007 was in June. CS4 was released in August of 2008. A little bit over a year. But since they had already started the roadmap planning, because it was officially announced by Apple that they would have Carbon 64-bit, the developer seeds had them, why would they change to Cocoa? The path was already there. And quite frankly, the short amount of time is not enough to start all over and redo the entire CS4 suite. They're not going to just sit here and just do Photoshop or Illustrator and say, oh, well, this is Cocoa, rest means Carbon. No, they're going to do the entire CS4 suite. So it didn't happen. And no matter what you think, it's an entirely different process. I know people will try to give application examples. It's one thing to get into the game with Apple and start off as Cocoa, because your API using Cocoa already went 64-bit. But if you've had history with Apple and moved along, you were in a Carbon environment or another API environment, and you stuck with it, Apple provided you a path, announced to you that you would have a path into 64-bit, that is a heck of a lot more sense to stick to that path than changing it over to Cocoa. Now, as far as the whole path of what's provided in developer seeds and what's stated, sure, things change. Another great example is ZFS. Yeah, it gets announced, hey, it's going to be part of it. Is it going to be used in Leopard? No, not going to be used in Leopard. Is it going to be used in Snow Leopard? No, but we'll let the server side have it. Things like that. So seeds for ZFS have been there. There's other things that are introduced for developers to use and play with, and then announcements are made within Apple and then retracted, and this kind of thing happens. But you can't blame Adobe when an official keynote announces the use of such technologies, and the seeds then follow up based upon that keynote. Then there's the argument that Adobe and Microsoft kind of pitted Apple in the place where they were with Carbon. Well, that's not entirely true. A lot of applications that came in the game well when OS X was underway, and very viable to even put under Yellow Box when Rhapsody was out there, take QuickTime could have been converted when iTunes was purchased from that, Green company, I forget the name of the company, Cassidy and Green, that, hey, it didn't go to Cocoa, it stayed in Carbon. I wonder why. I wonder what the original code was. Maybe it was too costly in length of time to rewrite it in Cocoa. There are many other applications that slowly turned over to Cocoa, Finder being of one that finally went over in Snow Leopard. It needs to be understood that, hey, not everybody's going to, like for Microsoft, program in Visual Basic or C#. And on the Mac side, they got to understand not everybody's going to program in Objective-C. And quite frankly, iTunes over to Windows, they're going to keep it in a language that's far easier to port than Objective-C then writing a version for Objective-C, and then writing a version for C# or Visual Basic. The thing of it is that Apple took out Carbon 64-bit support because Leopard was falling behind. They delayed its release, and Apple's own applications like QuickTime, iTunes, Final Cut Studio all remained in Carbon, 2 of which are still in Carbon. In the end, both companies had to make reasonable decisions, which are business decisions, and that's fine. Adobe had its path, Apple changed its mind, and I'm sure Apple changed its mind for good reasons. Nonetheless, it wasn't really sufficient time for Adobe, but Adobe is responding, and CS5 will be revamped and the new API having 64-bit support. Thanks for watching.